La vida es corta sin parar, mirar y de reír para celebrar. Cada momento hay que gozar, como si mañana no va a llegar.
Hola, hola. Welcome to Entre Tías Amiguis, the podcast where we dive into the wild roller coaster ride of adulting. I'm your host, Adri Rodriguez, a queer Salvadorian native, a first-gen trailblazer, a multipreneur and licensed psychotherapist, here to share wisdom, stories, and real talk with my tías and amiguis and other incredible guests who inspire and uplift our community. I want to remind you that while I am a licensed psychotherapist, this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. The discussions we have here are not substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Now let's dive into today's conversation and explore the journey of adulting together. Grab your cafecito, get comfy, and let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Entre Tías y Amiguis. I'm Adri Rodriguez, your host. My pronouns are she, her, hers, ella. I'm a queer, Latinx, inmigrante, originally from El Salvador. And I always start introducing myself with my identities because everything that I do professionally, personally, or my relationships are through the lens of those experiences that I've had. And so the goal here Entre Tías y Amiguis is to have pláticas that are real, that are heart to heart, but that also we're talking about topics that may be stigmatized, maybe a little bit difficult to talk about or even to think about. And so today I have one of my very, very favorite creators. I've followed her from like the journey as a creator to now becoming like amigas, colegas. And so it is such a pleasure to have Violeta here with us. And la plática que vamos a tener today is about family estrangement. And so you're one of the experts on this topic, and I'm super excited to have you here. But before we begin, why don't you introduce yourself to us and tell the community, some of your identities, some of the things that guide this work, but also like some of the fun things that you do. It's not just about being like the professional part.
Thank you so much, Adri, for having me here, inviting me. I really feel honored. And like you said, I consider you a friend, a colleague. So this is really exciting. Let's see. So I am Violeta. I'm a Mexican licensed mental health therapist and clinical social worker, and I support people who do not feel safe and supported by their families. Let's see. I am also the owner of Latinx Estrangement, and I started my content, my focus on family estrangement, specifically within the BIPOC community, but with my content, it tends to be more related to my own experience of being Latinx. I'm also queer, so a lot of my followers and the clients that I work with identify typically as queer and or daughters that are struggling with relationships with family and processing their own family trauma. On top of that, I'm also the mother. I'm also a mother. I'm a former teen mom, so I'm the mother of an adult queer daughter and also a suegra now because she has a girlfriend. And so I've been rebuilding my relationship with her since I started therapy in 2021, my own therapy. And then on top of that, I'm a part-time aqua fitness instructor. It is so much fun. I could talk about that forever, but that's not the focus today.
La siguiente entrevista vamos a hablar de eso.
Yeah, so I'm doing these different things, but ultimately I support people who do not feel safe and supported by their families.
I love that. So I want to begin just kind of jumping right in. Like, what inspired you? I know there's a little bit of your own story, and we've connected about our own stories around estrangement. But just for our listeners, what was the inspiration? How did you find that there was this area of need? And I really appreciate how you're not just talking about it like the estrangement, just like this general, but like something you said, safe and supported, right? Because estrangement maybe it's the assumption of just like a complete cutoff, but you're also talking about this idea of like feeling safe and supported in our families of origin. So what inspired you? How did you decide that this was going to be the focus for you?
That's a good question. So when I entered private practice in 2021, it actually aligned with me going through my own therapy and also, at that time, my supervisor and mentor, Adriana Alejandre, she's the owner of Latinx Therapy. She said, you need to narrow down a niche. And I thought, I don't know why. All I know is my own experience. And even though I knew I wasn't alone, I knew that within the queer community, and actually I should back up. My own experience is having been disowned from my family by my parents And it wasn't the first time, but for them, once I started speaking up for myself and challenging their rules and their expectations, they did not take that well. And just coming, for me, I'm the firstborn, the only daughter in a Mexican family. It just was not taken well. So they had disowned me. So I knew that feeling and the experience of being abandoned by family. And I knew I wasn't alone because I knew it was a common experience in the queer community. However, they did not know about my sexuality as a bisexual woman. In this case, it had more to do with not meeting their expectations as a daughter. So when I started doing some more research and having to really center my niche, it was, okay, actually, that it led me into this rabbit hole of understanding more about marianismo, machismo, and not even just cultural pressures, but also societal. And then that led me even more into family violence and violence against women, and just how common it is for women in our culture. But I think in this case, where a lot of people relate to me is the pressures of being a daughter and a sister, and the violence, or even the being ostracized, what the abandonment that they'll feel if they don't step up the way they're expected to. Mm-hmm. So that led me into, it's a combination of things, but my experience and then just career-wise is what led me into focusing on family estrangement.
Mm-hmm. You know, something that is coming up to mind is like this idea that many of us therapists, what the work that we end up doing, whether sometimes very conscious, sometimes not so conscious, is like the things that also we have experienced and that we have been able to overcome or are still healing through, because some of these things are going to be an ongoing healing journey for the rest of our lives, right? But this point of what am I good at, not only as a therapist, what skills do I have, but also what is my lived experience, and how can my lived experience in a way that is still safe for the clients, that is still centering their experiences, but that I as a human, right, I shared this human experience with you. And I think that for many of us Latinx, BIPOC, queer therapists, we are encountering ourselves in this like journey that sometimes is very parallel to the clients that we're seeing. So how has this journey of your own family, and to the degree that you feel comfortable sharing, how has it influenced the approach that you have taken to doing your work? Because it is multi-layered, it's very complicated, sometimes it's over a span of years. And so your own experience, how has it fed into learning about this work and doing this work with clients and with people?
Well, it's definitely helped me to have a deeper understanding of why it is so difficult to make changes with family. And one thing I tell my clients is that you are challenging a whole family system. It's not just, people. It's a whole system in place. And also tell me to understand the grief of missing people that have hurt you. And even the longing to want to be a part of that family, even when it does not serve you well. The other part of it is understanding that there can also be indifference. Some people are not going to miss. There's going to be some family members, my extended family, it's just indifference. And that definitely has been helpful. Those three areas have been really helpful, and me being able to support my clients who often feel a lot of pressure to reconcile or to fix themselves or the relationship. There tends to be definitely a lot of shame and guilt. It definitely a lot of grief whenever they have created distance, even if they may still have contact with that family, but they know that it's different. It's not like other families that they either see in the media or with people that they're friends or other family members. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
What is the usual entry point? Because maybe what is crossing my mind is this thought that as a therapist, if a person doesn't come directly and say, hey, I'm having estrangement from my family, right? You mentioned grief, you mentioned guilt, you mentioned like other elements that usually would bring people in. What is the entry point usually for folks that are coming in? Maybe for you, because you're directly talking about this, like people are coming in, but perhaps for other therapists are not thinking about how family estrangement might show up for their clients. What are some of those entry points that we should be looking at, do you think?
Actually, that's a really good question, because oftentimes people have come to me when if for whatever reason, if let's say family may not be the priority for them, it typically is because they do not feel like they're in control of their feelings, and they really struggle with managing relationships outside of families. Specifically when it comes to dating, they really struggle, and at work. They have a really hard time speaking up for themselves. So a lot of times they will start there, and then we start looking at the parallels to the relationships they have with family and how they feel about themselves. Those are definitely two entry points that why they will first initiate therapy with me. For those that already are centered, they already know they're coming about family issues. But even then, a lot of times they do not have the language to interpret their experience. So they don't even recognize that family violence exists and why it's been such a challenge. And then managing relationships, setting boundaries, speaking up for themselves with family and outside of family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so as you're describing this, you've used the word violence a couple of different times. And I think it's really important to name, because I think it might be an experience that some people might feel like, is this like a justifiable anger that I have? Is this estrangement justifiable, right? Did the things that happened to me, were they big enough? It seems like other people in my family are completely fine with these things happening and not have a problem, but somehow I'm having a problem with it. And so I noticed the word of family violence, right? And so how are you encompassing estrangement under this umbrella of family violence?
Well, we look at why the relationship as it exists, why is that? And oftentimes they think, again, that they're the problem. They think something is wrong. But we look at the beliefs and values of the family and how that has perpetuated them feeling unsafe and unsupported. And oftentimes it's getting them to recognize, well, what is family violence? I don't always throw that out there right away because that is very heavy for them and that can really scare them off. I've learned.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So we do talk about emotional abuse and neglect and how even that can be unintentional, but it is still a form of violence. And then, of course, sexual, physical, verbal, just all the overlaps. And then oftentimes it takes a while for them to, again, I don't try to sit there and, especially if it's emotional abuse and neglect, that is one that they have a really hard time recognizing as part of family violence. The other part is also the relationships with their siblings, oftentimes getting them to understand that sibling violence is family violence. So it's just giving language to the experiences. We start there. And then again is, how does it show up in your relationships outside of family? So getting them to identify the parallels. And then ultimately it's how they feel about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So they're constantly the self-blaming, the self-judging, the critiquing, well, all of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What misconceptions about family estrangement do you commonly hear? What are kind of the ways that people are kind of having to unpack and dismantle through to really see that the estrangement is valid for them, and that what they have experienced as they continue to process it, it's violence, right? And so what are some of those misconceptions or those barriers that you're hearing from people when they're investigating their estrangement?
There's a few of them. So one is that, again, something's wrong with them, that they're bad people, and that they have to forgive. That is a big one, that they have to forgive, because oftentimes there's this belief that in order to heal properly is that you have to forgive. But what that really does is there's this belief that they did something wrong, and oftentimes they didn't do anything wrong, other than just exist to their family. So the idea that they have to forgive, that they cannot be angry. And I help them to normalize anger and how to use that as, how outlets to use that to fuel them into change that would be what they're looking for. And sometimes it's just sitting with the anger. But again, that being angry means you're this bad person, or you're perceived to be holding this grudge. And if you are, again, something's wrong with you. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that it has to be no contact. No, I honestly feel like the majority of my clients and followers that I talk to about estrangement, most of the time, they're just low contact. Oftentimes they have contact with family. They're just not, it's either superficial, or they just have these pretty decent boundaries in place. And oftentimes they don't want to do no contact, or they can't they can't because of emotional and financial resources that they depend on. So the grief also is another thing. People have a hard time understanding. Other people outside of the experience of estrangement don't understand why they would miss somebody that has hurt them, and that they think that they don't care about family that they're estranged from. And then the other one, finally the last one, is because in our sessions, we do talk about decentering family, decentering men. There is a component of what we do. We look at patriarchy and misogyny and machismo. And a lot of times they think I hate men. It's like, no, I believe in accountability. And so I get them to understand why that's important. But there's a lot of misconceptions about estrangement, why it happens, and also the coping with it. Those are just areas that tend to have those misconceptions.
You know, as you're talking, so I've shared with you that I have a personal relationship with this topic, right? And I'm estranged with my family. It's been about 12 years. And so as you're listing all these things, I'm thinking about all like the stages and moments that I've gone through my own story of kind of coming to peace with the estrangement, right? Because I've heard messages from like, se buena hija, perdónalos, right? And it's just like, what do you mean? Like, be a good daughter, right? Like, I am being a good daughter. I am a good daughter. Or, you know, tus papás te quieren. And it's just like, oh, like, do they though? Like, but is this like the type of love that I want to receive? And so there is all this external sort of pressure that I know that I have felt. And I think that many clients also, when I've treated estrangement in my own practice as a therapist, that there is this external sort of messaging about what estrangement should look like. And in a great majority that there should not be estrangement, that somehow we should keep like in touch, or that we should be the bigger people. And so there is external factors, but there's also a bunch of the internal factors. I know that I've experienced the grief. I've experienced the guilt. I've experienced the missing them. I've experienced the I love them. I've experienced all of this part, and it can be like really like a tug of war between like this external and this internal value system that is like constantly being put on you when you are a person that is like in the middle of estrangement with your family members, right? Because in my experience, I've felt that the external is encouraging to forgive and to be good and to overlook and to get past the things, while my internal sort of intuitive like voice is saying like, absolutely not. You got to protect yourself. You got to take care of yourself first. And so this tug of war can be really confusing for people. And so I appreciate your approach, that as you are not only addressing the estrangement, but that you're also talking about the impact of the relationships, the way that is showing up at work, but also the decentralizing of family. Because in Latino culture, right, we're a collectivistic culture. And so this encouragement of like the collective first, the well-being for everybody first, like your decisions are impacting everyone, can really get in the way of making like a personal decision that is attuned to your intuition and what feels right and healthy at the stage of the healing that you're in, right? So that is what comes to mind.
Yes, no, you're right. And I think that's something that, that speaking of misconceptions, is the idea like, okay, you're not upholding the family. You don't care about family, and it's more individualistic. And it's really a double-edged sword when you come from a family that values collectivism. The thing is, there's like anything, there's pros and cons. And so really assessing, what do you need at this time? What are your options though? Because not everybody is going to have the financial and emotional resources. That will lead into like, okay, what emotionally, how do you feel about the relationship now? Because even though logically we can know that this is not serving me well, it's harmful to be here, emotionally, I may just not be there yet. I'm not ready to move out, or I'm not ready to stop, or, reduce my contact. I'm just not ready. And so addressing the emotions along with we'll say like the logical part, that's a process, and oftentimes take like somatic exercises, of course, because as you know, talking it out just isn't always going to be the solution. It's getting people to recognize how their body responds to their families, the interactions, and really like their triggers. And then learning how to regulate that or work through it, not just by themselves, but también with community. So it is a whole process, but the emotions part is very important.
Going back to the collectivistic versus individualistic perspective of looking at estrangement, I know that your focus is on BIPOC folks and so likely from very collectivistic cultures, but what kind of discourse have you heard in your training or even like more content that is being created by other people that you see a difference between this collectivistic values versus individualistic values? Because I have seen examples of like content, say on TikTok or on Instagram, where it's just like no contact, cut off, right? And I think about how that may not work for a variety of reasons, like you're talking about, but also like the part that comes to mind is like, when I went into my estrangement, I've also lost contact with about 70 people, right? Like all my first cousins. I come from a very large family. So all the cousins are attached to my parents' side, my mom's side, particularly, which is a bigger family. I have lost contact with all the 70 people, right? And so there is this like way in that collectivistic values do look very differently because many families, and now this is not to generalize, but many families do have relationships not only with the nuclear family, but also with everybody else. So what are some of those differences that you're seeing between individualistic and collectivistic sort of talking about estrangement?
Okay, so some of the differences definitely are options. One also is, like you said, there's going to be more reliance, dependency on family outside of that immediate family. So extended family, family friends, versus like a more individualistic, really you're focusing on just your needs versus the whole family and friends. I would say there's this, if you decide to prioritize your needs, yourself, there's this perception that you are considered selfish. Now, I will say for those that come from a more individualistic culture, oftentimes they are white people. There's a perception that they're brave or that they're just like this, I can't think of it right now, but there's just this positive correlation with that. Now, I also don't blame our culture or other cultures for the value of collectivism because it has helped us to survive. However, as we are adapting to a new generation where our needs change, it is adjusting to where a more interdependence, where it's finding the balance with relying on family versus also putting yourself first at times. It's a process. It takes practice. But there's definitely a lot of guilt when it comes to prioritizing yourself when you come from a collective culture. I'm trying to think of a question. I got a little distracted.
It's okay. Thinking about just collectivistic and individualistic different, right? So maybe here I can bridge into a different, like into the second part of the question is like, you already touched on like machismo and a little bit of marianismo, but I think marianismo continues to be a very, like a newer term. So how do you see some of the collectivistic values of Latinx family, particularly, right? Because we orient ourselves as collectivistic culture, machismo, marianismo sort of keep us in line into the collectivistic value of our family, right? So can you talk about Latinx cultural values and how do they play on also here with estrangement?
Yes. So oftentimes whenever, for instance, something like marianismo, where there's these expectations of traditional gender roles. So for a lot of women in the family, daughters, wives, tias, cousins, they are going to be expected to be primarily caregivers. Even if they're encouraged to go to school, they are still going to have more pressure to prioritize family. That can be a lot for them. And so whenever there's that constant pressure when there's constant pressure to prioritize others before you, there's going to be feelings of resentment. And that's where the distance starts to come in. It may not be physical estrangement. It may be more emotional. So you're giving less emotionally. You're not sharing as much about your personal life. You're just not expressing much about yourself. And at times you may even dislike those certain family members. At some point, though, especially when you have more daughters becoming business owners and, attaining advanced degrees, then you're going to start seeing more estrangement that turns into physical estrangement. They're moving away. They're moving out, moving away. So these are some of the things that come up and how marianismo plays into estrangement. However, it's not to say that it's more, again, the pressures and the expectations of being a woman in the family that is creating that distance. It's not because women are more successful. I think just what happens is that becomes like this catalyst to make it, to finally put yourself first.
Mhm. Yeah. So as women, femme-identified, queer folks, as people who are disenfranchised, are able to sustain themselves because they have access to education, because they have access to a business, because they have sustainable employment, then it's like, oh, it's not that you're becoming better than us and so you're pulling away from the family, but it's actually you're secure enough now to be able to take some of the more harsher steps or more difficult because you're able to provide yourself safety.
Oh, definitely. Because you have to think a lot of times what keeps a lot of queer family members, daughters from creating distance is because of that reliance. So we have the collectivism where you are relying on each other to survive. So that can be childcare, housing, health insurance, transportation. In some cases, they work for the family. But the more resources you have, the less reliance you're going to, there's going to be less reliance. Where you do see with someone who is a bit more individualistic, there's more options for them to have boundaries. Now, with that said, yes, exactly the way you framed it, it's just like that. And there's just also less emotional resources that you'll need. So perhaps less validation that you're going to need about your decision making when you can get that from community outside of your family. And for many, that's their jobs and school.
Mm-hmm. So it's not only the physical resources of money and housing, but also the emotional resources. Do I have other people in my life that I can feel supported by as I make the decision within the spectrum of just getting further and further away? Two things. One thing that popped up, and then my other question is, what is the spectrum of estrangement that you're seeing? Because you talked about the estrangement is not always just like the physical cutoff, right? That sometimes that it starts with that emotional distancing, right? And so can you talk a little bit about the spectrum of what is referred to as estrangement? Because I do think that sometimes when we're having the conversation about estrangement, there is an automatic assumption that you're going to go and be like ruthless and cut off. But you were kind of sprinkled on it. But can you talk about that spectrum of like the emotional disconnect all the way to physical, low or no contact at all?
Sure. So the low contact is kind of thinking like the bare minimum. And that'll lead into, we're going to say again, it's the spectrum of low contact all the way to no contact. And within that, we're going to say within that area is a whole gray area. And for some, again, it might be sharing less about themselves. It might be just having less contact. Not no contact, but just less. It might be participating less in family events. It might be just less quality time. So it's also bare minimum is just keep it cordial. Keep it cordial. Also, you know the language of your family. You know what to say. You know what not to say. So you keep it cordial, and it's really learning how not to engage when there's certain times that when it feels like you're being picked on, when it feels like they're instigating. It's learning how to really pick your battles. And it's hard. It's not easy. You're also human. So as a therapist, I help people to also have compassion for themselves. There's going to be times there will be that reaction that the harmful family member is looking for. But again, it takes practice. So the other thing is life experiences are going to change when it comes to the contact you have with family. So for some, let's just say they decide to go no contact. They may find that, again, with the grief that they missed a certain family member that is aging, and as they're getting older, they just feel like, you know what, I want to be there somehow. I want to see them because there is a fear of regret that this person will die. There's also them becoming parents. They may feel like, you know what, maybe I can reconsider my stance on this. And I'm not saying this happens all the time. There's someone like me who it is going to be no contact, and it has been. It's permanent. But again, it's knowing that it can change everything from low contact to no contact and all the way back around because of grief. It oftentimes has a cycling in and out of it. And like I said, it just takes practice. It depends on emotional needs and financial needs. For some, they also want access to their siblings, younger family members. I've had clients where they're no contact with their dad, but they want to continue to visit their mom. So it really looks different for everybody, and it just really depends on their needs. Finally, the last thing will involve family violence. For many, there's a lot of fear and even the idea of moving out. So if they feel threatened physically and or emotionally, that can really just paralyze them for the moment. It's like, okay, I'll work on a plan to move out, but for now, I just need just keep it cool, try to do bare minimum. And that's where they also learn how to have a community outside of the family to eventually get to where they want. I never force anybody to go no contact, but I can feel sometimes that they expect that. So anyways, we talk about what they need instead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think even in itself, that could be a barrier for folks to talk about their estrangement, right? Or like being in this emotional low contact or still in contact, but emotionally guarded, protected, keeping safe. Because I know that there has been clients that I've worked with that feel a tremendous pressure to come back and to say, I hung out with my family again, and there's shame and embarrassment. And it's like, no. Like your estrangement, it is about your safety, and it is about a spectrum of behaviors and ways of being and interacting with the family that allow your safety first, right? And if your choice is to remain in contact with your family, then the focus will be like, how do you remain safe? How are you establishing that safety for yourself? But a lot of people do, I think, worry about the moment that they bring estrangement into therapy work, that there's going to be this expectation that you cut people off, right? And particularly for our culture, for all the reasons that we've been exploring, it doesn't necessarily always will work in that way. And also, if your choice is to go non-contact, you also will have our 100% support, but that is not the only way to manage estrangement, right? And I've also, in my work with adult families, oftentimes I will have the two people that are like in the middle of this estrangement, but that are trying to figure out how to build some kind of relationship. And a lot of that work is about establishing really clear boundaries and expectations of how will they interact, right? And so even you can be estranged and even have a conversation really openly about why the estrangement is happening, what kind of boundaries are you going to be establishing, right? But there may be also other families where that conversation never happens. So there is no right or wrong way to do the estrangement. Just sort of, I'm hearing you now from one of the experts, right? There is no right or wrong way in the spectrum, and it's all about what makes you feel safe and stable. And, it can change. It's dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like one researcher, I can't think of her name right now, but it's not bad. She says it's not bad. It's not good. It's just necessary. It's just that, and it can change.
Mm-hmm. How does guilt and grief, maybe starting with guilt, because I know that Catholic guilt is also part of those Latinx values, right? Just like marianismo brings guilt, collectivism brings guilt, hierarchy that we're going to respect our elder. Like there is tons of ways to kind of guilt to enter the space. And so how does guilt show up for people who are navigating the beginning steps of estrangement, but also all the way to being no contact, right? At the latter end of the spectrum. What is the role of guilt in here, and how perhaps people can look at guilt a little bit different as they're going through this process?
Oof. Guilt is definitely a very common theme that comes up when I'm talking with clients or followers. That's got to be like the number one question I get is what do I do with the guilt? How do you manage it? One is getting to know it. So noticing how far back we go with guilt. And that's where recognizing a lot of the beliefs that we inherit from family, a lot of it is taught through the use of guilt as a tool to get you to behave or do things that you're required to do. And that goes back to like religion for most, maybe not all, but the majority in our culture. And that's where the Catholic guilt comes up, right? And so, but unfortunately though, over time, your family doesn't even need to be there for you to feel guilty. They don't even need to be physically there. So now you start to exert that onto yourself. But again, it's due to deep conditioning. So, in our sessions, we talk about that and talk about like, okay, the decision that you're trying to make, is it coming from a place? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from a set of beliefs that you were taught, or is it the set of beliefs that you're trying to establish And then again, it's getting to know how the body's responding to the guilt. And also it's reducing the shame of it. It's normalizing like guilt. It does. And I tell them almost every decision you make, there's going to be some type of guilt. Like, oh, I should have studied this or I should have worn this. So it's normal, and really just helping them to align with where they want to be. The guilt may never go away. I'm telling you, as somebody that has, been in no contact, the guilt may never go away. It's really us just reducing the intensity of it and going from there. So it is transforming the relationship with guilt. Some of the different techniques can be everything from just, talking about it to also practicing new habits. And again, more the somatic of helping them to release the feelings, either by writing it out or using creativity or some type of outlet to help release when it becomes very intense.
Mm-hmm. The thought that comes to my mind as you touch into guilt is also guilt as a protective factor towards anger, because many of us are actually maybe validly and rightfully angry, right, at what has led to the estrangement in whatever part of the spectrum you're in. But so the thought comes to mind also, like guilt kind of being this protective factor, that if I am blaming myself, that if I am saying I'm the bad daughter, I feel really bad that I've done this, like I should have found a way, right? If we direct the guilt internally, right, like it is, it sometimes can distract us from actually the anger that we feel towards what has led to the estrangement, right? And so in a way, it's almost like internalized perpetuation of that same violence that we learned in our home, that guilt kind of keeps bringing us back to that point.
Oh, you said it perfect. Yes.
So with grief, though, so then there's the second part, right? There's guilt, there is grief. What do you see? How does grief contribute to this cycle of estrangement and reconciliation? Because I could think about like the times that I've, had my heart to being like, am I making the right decision, right? And it's like that pain, grief, that may sometimes encourage or create like an idea or a fantasy of like what could be happening instead. And so let's talk a little bit about grief and how do you see it show up in estrangement?
Well, the grief is definitely normal. It's going to come up, and just like guilt, it may never go away. Again, it may reduce, but it may not. And the grief, oftentimes we long for those good moments, so those loving moments. Even like in the discussion of domestic violence, also family violence, oftentimes people stay because there are good times. There is like, oh, I see the potential. There are moments when parents or family members that are harmful, there's times that they're not. There's times that they're actually present with you. They're supportive. It's unfortunately though, we can get caught up in that, and we hope things will be different, because I think a lot of people assume that when we go no contact or just create some distance where it's low contact, that actually is an opportunity for people to reflect and to make changes. And it can happen. And you might see a sprinkle of that from family that once you create stronger boundaries. However, it's the lack of consistency that they struggle with. But either way is that, yes, the grief can have you feeling hopeful and again, longing for a family that has hurt you. And that's just where we do constant check-ins to see where are you at with your grief. And then it's creating new traditions and community and redefining family, because there is this mindset a lot of times that even though it was a dysfunctional family, it was my family. So there is wanting to protect that and go back to what a lot of people do. But oftentimes what they'll see is like being pushed away or just forced to have to create distance again. And sometimes that will be the whole relationship. It'll just depend on everybody. It'll just depend for each person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This, what brings to mind is like, the people that are experiencing estrangement, not by their choice. So for example, myself, like I haven't chosen this estrangement. Like this is something that is been decided by external folks, and that if my choice was, is like, we will be all in therapy talking about the things, right? But they are not willing to do that. And so, grief, how does grief show up for people who are more in the receiving end of estrangement, where their family members, where they may have the willingness and the desire to reconnect and to create this new healthy family dynamics, but their family is not receiving it well? Do you see that happen for some people, and like what is kind of how does grief show up in those scenarios? Because it's a little bit different than when you are the one making the choice. There is a little bit perhaps of like empowerment that is like, I've made this decision, right, to put myself first and to take care of myself. But for folks who also are on the receiving end of estrangement and there is not a lot of movement, there's a different sort of lens in grief, I think, in there.
Yeah, definitely. So in my case, like being disowned. And sometimes it's not like an outward, like, you're not welcome here. I mean, my dad was like, you are no longer, I will no longer have a relationship with you. For some, it's just, you're not welcomed. You're being ostracized. You're being left out. So again, it's more the family deciding you are not part of this family anymore. There is a tremendous, it is a different type of grief, I think. And you can feel powerless. And so really talking about what does letting go of a family that you used to belong, you felt like you belonged, even though, again, it was harmful at times. Again, that was still our family. So talking about what acceptance looks like and moving on and creating your own closure. But also remember, you can test the waters again if you want. Some people do, because just like we may change and reconsider our stance on the relationship, they might also. They may have time to reflect and think, well, you know what? Maybe this wasn't the best decision. Either way, so again, we look at the grieving process of that. It will take practice, and again, redefining family and creating new traditions as you grieve. Because change is not easy, whether you're one to initiate the low to no contact, or that was something you were forced to have to deal with. So yes, it is different, and it just may never go away, but it's creating a relationship with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this idea of at first just tolerating that this is happening to you and moving into like the acceptance, right? That unfortunately, despite your best efforts and desires, the family members that you're experiencing this with are also needing to be participants in order to be able to move on in a healthy way, right? Because the potential is like you could come back, but you could come back into this very unhealthy terms. And then in that way, for me, at least particularly, has been a way of empowering myself in terms of the estrangement, that it is that in order to regain a relationship with my family, the requirement, the ask that they're making is an ask of like putting myself away, basically, right? And in that sense, for me, is an unworkable offering, right? Because it would require too much of a sacrifice for myself. And so in this process of going from like tolerating the grief, the pain of receiving it, tolerating that this is a dynamic, all the way to accepting like that the family unit, the family system, the way they moves in ways that is not sustainable or healthy for you, then in that way also you can find, I think, empowerment in making a decision about how do you want to hold the grief that comes from the loss of this family that you used to belong. So do you think that reconciliation is often the goal, or like that most people are looking to reconcile after estrangement? What are you seeing from the clients that you're working? What is kind of the end point of getting in a healthy relationship with estrangement?
Honestly, I would say that's actually rarely the focus. Typically their goal is to feel more confident and to work on the guilt and the grief. That's typically what the goal is. Reconciliation usually comes way further down.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes they don't have that choice. So we're more focused on learning what they're capable of, rebuilding themselves. And so at some point though, when it comes up about reconciliation, it's going to look more like on their, at least somewhat on their terms. And I think they often find that they just have very different values and beliefs from that family that they initially wanted to be a part of. But they have to find themselves first in order to even consider what a healthy reconciliation is. Now, for some, I think for those that have low contact, rarely when they're no contact, but when they're more low contact, where they still have contact with family, the reconciliation looks more like maybe going over for the holidays, spending more time with them. So it might just be increasing their contact some, but that would probably be, that's the only time that I'm trying to think right now. when they're considering like having more contact with family. But reconciliation, we talk about it. What would that look like? And for a lot of people that are already no contact, it's usually from a distance. For example, with aging parents, there's a lot of guilt that starts to come up knowing that either their parent is struggling with homelessness while aging, or they're with addiction and just finding
medical care, different.
All of that starts to come up. That's where the guilt comes in. So then it's like, okay, do I make contact? But what they learn, and me as a social worker, I've been able to talk to them about, like, is there a case manager or a social worker that you can, a third party that you can go through? And your resources, does it allow for you to provide support that would be less harmful? So to them, emotional support would be too much, but financial support they're okay with. So that's where how so far a lot of the sessions, but reconciliation, it doesn't tend to be a focus quite, especially not in the beginning.
So it's really interesting to think about some of the folks that are coming to see you and some of the folks that are coming to see me, and the difference, because in adult family therapy, one of the things that I have been working with very often, it is coming to therapy as a family with the people that you are in estrangement with to try to reconcile. And so the difference between that relational work versus that individual work, right? That the individual work is about strengthening the self and being able to find a way to live with this very difficult situation, to strengthen your own self-esteem, your own value, building new relationships, right? And then there is this other sort of work also that can happen, which is some of the work that I've done, and estrangement too, with adult families that are coming and they're saying, okay, let's actually face the issue that we have, the histories that we have, the secrets that we haven't talked about, and being able to find a way of moving forward together. But there is like a different approach into the individual versus the relational with as a family unit coming in to do therapy work.
Yeah, it's a great point. It is. Yeah, but it's different.
So how can individuals, go ahead.
Oh, I think that's probably intentional, because I think when they see my story and just see the content, I think that's what brings them here, is that they're just in a place where they're trying to rebuild themselves and find a sense of identity and control.
Yeah. So, as kind of we start wrapping up, kind of the last question that I have is more about the other family members or other individuals, spouses, friends, right? Because I, in my own experience with estrangement, I have received both very supportive messaging, but also sometimes things that in the effort to support me actually can be really invalidating to my experience, right? Like something like, one day you'll be able to find a way back. And it's just like, no, like I don't think that's going to happen. Like, I thank you, right? Or something like, oh, they don't even know what they're missing. And it's just like, that sounds actually, I hear your intention, but it's actually not very helpful, because it can actually increase the grief or the confusion of just like, then why don't they love me? Then why don't they want me? Right. So there's this like part of being a good friend, bystander, family member, chosen family member, spouse of someone who is in estrangement, who may have also a different dynamic with their own family. So how can individuals support their loved ones who are experiencing family estrangement? In every case, it's going to be different, but just some thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think for anybody that doesn't understand or can't relate, fully relate, or wants to know how to support those that are going through estrangement, the two things is hold space, acknowledge feelings. That's really it. And I think just saying, again, even if you don't fully agree or understand, just saying, I can see why you would feel that way. That's it. Or, if they seem like they're expressing, just being curious, like, okay, well, tell me if you could have the capacity, know your limits, but okay, well, tell me about it, asking them to talk a little bit about it, depending on what you want to hear, your capacity. But that's it. You do not have to offer solutions. You don't even have to talk badly about their family. You don't even have to do that.
Yeah. Show up, hold space, know your line when you are over at capacity and cannot hear it. And I think also know your triggers, because sometimes this estrangement can be triggering for other people who maybe just feel manage their family dynamics a little bit differently than the person that decided estrangement, and especially those that have gone no contact, right? Like a person that you might be sharing your story with might be in a similar situation, might think that estrangement would be actually a healthy choice for them, but for a variety of circumstances, they may not be able to get to that point themselves. And so it can be triggering. So being able to also understand your limits before you're offer support to somebody who's going through estrangement.
Yeah, definitely know your limits, because asking them, like, tell me about it may not be in your best interest or theirs. So just again, I can see how you would feel that way. And then also inviting them to spend time together can be super helpful. And that's part of where people are looking to, it's helpful for them to rebuild community and create new traditions. I can tell you how meaningful it has been to me and even the people that I work with. And an invite, they may not go, but a lot of times I notice that they will consider going versus being alone. It just depends, but the invites are really valuable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as we wrap up, Violeta, what message do you want listeners to take? We touched into so many great things, and it's like, I know that my brain is just like going. But what is, if you could encapsulate our conversation today, our plática, what message do you want our listeners to take about navigating, supporting, being in estrangement, and also the support that you can get from therapists and the work that you can do around it?
I just think it's that one quote that always stands out to me and my clients is like, estrangement is not bad or good. It's just necessary. Really just that, and know that it can change. And it's also an opportunity for every person in the family, including you, to reflect and think about, what do you want different? What can be different? What do you want to change? That's it.
I love that. An opportunity to reflect.
It's an opportunity for me to
say about it or try to make it something else. It's just an opportunity to reflect.
Yeah, because a lot of times people think they have to fix themselves in the relationship. Take that space. Just not even thinking about fixing you. It has to be the solution. So.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I know that there's going to be many listeners that are going to really resonate with this, and both very practical but in actionable ways of just like, how do you think about estrangement? So I really appreciate your time and your generosity, your knowledge around this topic. And so on the show notes, I'm going to put all the details about how to follow your work, how to get in touch with you if you are interested in doing this work in therapy as well. And until next time, everybody, we'll be bringing another conversation. But thank you for today. We really, really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you, Adri. I really appreciate being here and talking about family estrangement. It was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Until next time.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with your tias and amiguis. Your support helps us reach more people and continue these important conversations. And don't forget to follow us on social media and stay connected. Until next time, remember to take care of yourself, embrace your journey, and keep living life with heart, vision, and creativity.